Curbside Asset at the Advent of Autonomous Vehicles webinar. Today, we're thrilled to have you with us. We're going to have a really exciting and interesting panel conversation. You know, there's a few things that you're going to need to know before I jump into it. My name is Jerry Boyer. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Harmonize Mobility, and today I'm going to be your host. I'm going to run the technology, and we'll be managing the questions through the GoToWebinar control panel. So those of you who have joined, if you want to ask questions, there is a drop down where you can ask the question. You can put that question specifically to one of the panelists, or you can send it to any panelists, and we'll figure out who to ask and get that question answered. So we're going to end exactly 1 hour from the start, and so we'll do our very best to answer all of your questions. This webinar is recorded, and so we will also be sharing the recorded version following the event. Okay, so I think that's all we need to know for housekeeping. So let's just jump right into it because we've got a lot of material to cover. So today we are pleased to have our returning moderator, Alana Coombs. Alana comes to us from the Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California, where she is researching the impact of autonomous vehicles on downtowns. Prior to this, Alana has largely been in UK governance with roles in public affairs, political advice, downtown management, regeneration, and public policy. Before heading to Los Angeles from the UK, she led the City of London's Smart City program and on the transport, design, and safety policies of the developing strategic planning strategy called City Plan 2036. Alana, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We're going to be looking at the curbside again, and this time we're going to have particular focus on autonomous vehicles and how they might impact on the curbside. Just a word on the format. We've got 4 speakers today, and I'm going to be asking them some questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions afterwards from you in the audience. And when you do put your questions in, please do say where what your affiliation is as well. So I'll move on to my first panelist, and that is Scott Levine. And Scott is Assistant Professor at SUNY, and he's also an Honorary Research Associate at Imperial College in London, and Visiting Professor at Jiao Tong University in China. And he's also an industry leader, really, focusing on emerging technologies and on a wide range of things that he does. He's also on the TRB Standing Committee on Public Transport Innovations, and he's a past trustee of the UK's Shared Mobility Trade Body, COMO UK, and also lots of publications as well. Scott, welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you, Elena.
Of course. And so I'm going to move on to my first question, Scott. So you've just published a paper about what cities are doing across the US to prepare for autonomous vehicles and to the changing curbside demands. And in that paper, and I just quote from it, you say that you warn about operational failures at the curbside are reported to spill over into travel lanes, and this impacts on public safety. I wonder if you could explain what these operational failures are and what you found cities are doing to mitigate some of these dangers.
Sure, it's a great question, Alana. Let me start by saying it's a real pleasure to join you in the panel for today's discussion. So what we did here, we spoke with leaders at about a dozen major cities, all US cities. This is pre-COVID, these interviews, about how they're managing their curb space, what might be changing today with all of these new pressures arising from Uber, Lyft type ride hailing, Amazon deliveries, micromobility. and of course, in coming years, autonomous mobility services. So just as you said, Alana, cities told us that what happens at the curbside, unfortunately, doesn't stay at the curbside if it's being inefficiently managed. One of our interviewees spoke, the one you're referring to, about a real crunch that occurs in their nightlife district when the restaurants and bars shut down late in the evening. And there's in their words, a rugby scrum of the individual ride-hailing drivers and the individual ride-hailing passengers all trying to connect with one another. They described the traffic flow on their main arterials being essentially brought to a standstill during this sorting process, with all sorts of safety issues for the pedestrians themselves and for the inability of public safety vehicles to maneuver to where they need to go. So let me talk a little bit about where cities are going, what they're doing to adapt to these changes in pressures on the curbside. We've heard about big changes taking place in how cities are managing their curbs. We've heard about cities that are completely rethinking what they previously termed their parking management teams into now rebranded as curb management teams. What this means is fresh new skill sets for their existing staff. It means additional staffing resources. It means new responsibilities, new ways of interacting with both their internal and their external stakeholders. One point that really struck me from the work we did on this paper was how diverse cities are in the approaches that they're taking to curb management. We heard of some cities being very proactive, engaging in pilot projects to incorporate new types of curbside regulations. PUDO, or pickup drop-off zones, is a new term that we learned. Cities passing new ordinances, collecting new types of data from new sorts of sensors, and so forth. Whereas other cities that we spoke with remain very much in reactive mode, as if the year is still 1980. So they respond to petitions, they respond to requests from adjacent property owners for a loading zone or whatever as they're submitted. But finally, enforcement, we learned, remains a huge issue at the curbside, as it always has been. Some of our cities reported that they don't yet have technology-enabled enforcement solutions. So instead, when they want to enforce, they've got to put people out there, and people have what many of our cities consider to be an unacceptably high cost to do that sort of a task.
Great, thanks Scott. That's a really helpful introduction to things. I think I'll turn to you, Salika, if I may now. So Salika is our second panelist, and she was formerly at the US Department of Transport, where she was Director, Executive Office Operations and Senior Advisor to the Office of the Administrator. And she's now Professorial Lecturer at American University. And importantly, she's also a thought leader and writes a huge amount and has a huge amount of experience in transport, political advocacy, and lots of other areas as well. So welcome, Salika.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And I'll turn to my question for you, if I may. We've seen and we've heard from Scott about lots of these changes at the curbside and sidewalk, and that we're going to expect more of this when autonomous vehicles come on stream. And I wondered if you could provide some sort of guidance here, really, in what is it that cities don't know that they should know as they prepare for the widespread deployment of autonomous vehicles?
Thank you. And I appreciate the research that Scott's doing, because I think it certainly aligns with what I'm seeing. Governments have created what I call this IV stream of revenue from parking behavior and vehicle infractions and driving misconduct. We know that autonomous vehicles, they just don't break the law. They follow the rules of the road. Those streams of revenue will begin to dry up. But it's a much broader set of issues that cities are going to face across the United States and, in fact, globally. When we look at what I call the political economy of autonomous vehicles, there is the political aspect, that government piece, in terms of the impact of our day-to-day lives and where dollars and cents of our taxpayers are involved. If I, as a resident of the city of Washington, D.C., commit an infraction today, I'm part of the $324 million that the Washington, D.C. collects every year in parking and driving violations. Autonomous vehicles has the real possibility of putting a significant damper in that revenue. Where are cities going to make up that loss? And as Scott points out, we are fighting for curbside use. It is the not just the ride-hail services, but it's the bikes, the scooters, the delivery bots, all vying for a place on the sidewalk. I think one of the greatest issues that is facing cities of today, and whether you're big or small, is getting a hold of what are your current revenue streams and where replacements are needed to get something in place or begin to work on it now. One of the things I can say is there are a lot of cities, and Scott pointed out as well in his research, who are very much active in addressing these issues today. They have AV work groups, they have lockstep with the AV manufacturers and testing in their cities so they can see or forecast how they will be impacted. And other cities just think it's a thing down the road 15 or 20 years from now, and they don't realize that it's knocking at their door. And certainly with COVID-19, we've seen an acceleration in some places, especially with delivery bots, of the use of those sidewalks. We're all vying for a place to deliver our goods, to transport our people, and yet we have infrastructure in this country, at least, that is woefully in need of a transfusion of dollars. We don't know where that's coming from right now.
Great, thank you, Sarika. I think you raised really important issues there. And it is, I get what I hear really is that there really is a potential for chaos at the curbside unless there's this kind of planning to get it right. And as Scott said, there are cities that are working with private companies to find solutions to some of the pressures that they're having at the curbside. And I think this is a good time to introduce our third speaker. Our third speaker is from one of those such companies, from Grid Smarter City. So our third speaker is Julian Wiggley. Welcome, Julian. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the products that Grid Smarter City has that are helping cities manage some of these pressures at the curbside.
Sure, thanks for inviting me today. So Grid has a family of solutions actually called Kerb, K-E-R-B, British English spelling of Kerb. And these solutions aim to reduce congestion caused by commercial vehicles particularly, and specifically freight and servicing vehicles, all competing for access at the curb in urban centres. And we view the urban freight sector not as one sector, but rather a collection of subsectors. And they all operate in different ways and have different requirements for curbside access. So they all need different but overlapping solutions for their curbside access problems. So 2 examples. Our first project delivered a solution for the parcel delivery sector in the UK, and now we're about to complete a project for the construction logistics sector. And although both these sectors are both called urban freight, they actually operate in completely different ways. And we have a product roadmap to build out more of these subsector solutions until we've got a complete stack for all curb users. And just in freight alone, I've counted over 15 different types of users. And in terms of the core curbside management functionality, we apply what's called permission-based digital solutions, and we overlay those onto the physical curbside in a combination of 3 fundamental approaches, really. So the first solution is pre-bookable time slots in loading zones, and those apply for vehicles that can deliver according to a relatively fixed schedule regularly at the same curbside location. So that could be, for example, a large truck delivering fresh goods to an on-street supermarket, as an example. The second solution we have is a zonal permit-based solution, and this is for vehicles that require more time flexibility or may park for shorter durations, so that the parcel delivery sector may well fall into that sector. And we also use that in combination with a product that's called virtual loading bay. And what this is it's a solution to spin up loading zones or staging zones or holding bays digitally in unmarked areas, so you don't have to mark these with paint or signs. And these are particularly useful when there's excess demand for loading zones or when a vehicle is blocking a loading zone. So basically, in this situation, a vehicle can be automatically directed to a different section of curb to either wait for loading zone availability or to do the unloading from that new location. And all these locations, the policies, the protocols, the behaviours at curbside can all be defined and pre-approved by city officials in advance. So management of these approaches can be fully automated. In addition to that, cities can set variable pricing for these solutions. So Salika mentioned about the lack of revenue from infringements. You can now start charging commercial vehicles to use the curbside. And the pricing is based on a number of factors such as day, time, vehicle size, or vehicle emissions. In the UK, air quality is a particularly big driver. So this can be used as a policy tool, if you like, to set higher prices for vehicles with higher emissions. And the aim is to nudge behaviour for fleet managers to consider buying electric vehicles when they refresh the fleet. Those payments are all built into our solution, so it's automatic, but we can also integrate with the city's preferred payment provider if required as well. And on top of all that, enforcement was mentioned, so we've got an enforcement app as well. This is where the enforcement officer simply checks the vehicle license plate against booking or permit information. So when they type the vehicle license number in, it calls our application via API, and we send back any permit information, any booking information for that section of curb space at that time. Or we can integrate with existing enforcement systems. And on top of that, a driver can report an illegally parked vehicle in the driver app itself. So if they turn up and there's somebody blocking a loading zone that they've already booked or they have a permit to use, they can report that vehicle to the nearest enforcement officer. And what I would say is all our solutions are developed using what's called an API first approach, which means they can be easily integrated with existing third-party applications such as a mobile payment solution. I'll give you an example of what we're currently working on. So there's an area in London where we time slice the same section of curb for different users over the course of the day. So for example, from 6 AM to 8 AM, it's a permit-based loading zone for goods deliveries. Then it switches to a passenger loading zone between 8 AM and 10 AM. Then it switches to a widened sidewalk. And the council, the borough in London, wants this to happen to accommodate social distancing for COVID-19. In addition to that, in order to communicate all these changing uses of the same section of the road and sidewalk, we're developing a digital sign. So the driver app will be able to communicate with the sign, and booking information will be exchanged. But this is primarily to inform the people who work and live in the immediate vicinity affected by these changes, the different roadside and sidewalk users, exactly what's happening at that moment in time. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like a huge range of things. It certainly seems that curbside management does seem to have moved on a huge amount in the last few years, certainly. So thank you very much, Julian.
Okay.
I'm now going to move on to our last speaker, and that is Bernd Grusch. Bernd, of course, is the founder of Harmonize Mobility and also the Chief Innovation Officer there. And he's also written a book called End of Driving, which certainly inspired me to get in contact with him first of all. And one of the themes in the book, Bernd, is the lack of attention to policy relating to autonomous vehicles. And I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about this issue about policy and why you think it's important, and also what else you think is missing in the planning and preparation for autonomous vehicles. I can't hear you, Bernd.
There's a good reason for that. Thank you. Anyway, thank you, Alana, and thank you for moderating this. It's really great, your work that you're doing here. So there's such a spread between what technology can offer and how responsive we are, and we hear from Scott about the rugby scrums, and that's a huge concern. We hear so many things from Celica that are in indicating that policy falls behind. There's issues of revenue loss that we're facing and so on. So it's almost always been the case that regulation trails technology. And we haven't even caught up with the car yet. If you think about the problems that we still have with parking, which we've had since the 1920s, as soon as there was a reasonable volume of cars, we've not solved those very well. We've struggled with that. I mean, look, all the work from people like Donald Shoup, for example. And we've not caught up with the ride-hailing industry. We've not caught up with e-scooters. And we're struggling with all of these things. And I understand that COVID has made a huge splash in all of this, and that's a little bit anomalous, but we were not ready in any regard for any of those things. And I think, to the point of all three speakers, we're facing potentially a far bigger and longer crunch in dealing with automation at the curb. The issue is that, just think about the rugby scrum that Scott talked about, though. That's handled by people who may be swearing at each other or blowing their horn or waiting or butting in, all the things that people do when they want to share space and they're looking for them out for themselves, and we use the middle finger and all those kinds of things that we don't have that opportunity with automated vehicles. So what does a sidewalk drone do when it's blocked? What does it do when it's in competition for a wheelchair? I took a photograph just yesterday of somebody on a wheelchair coming through a very narrow passage, and this passage was about 50 or 60 meters long, and it was just enough room for that wheelchair. And now we're going to, have a robotic vehicle coming in the other direction along the same passage. What happens? Does the vehicle back up? There's no protocol for those things. So that's really, the kinds of things, and I think Celica has pointed out very clearly, we need to start thinking about how all of these things are going to work, and we haven't even figured out how what we have is going to work. So that is, in a nutshell, my concern, or our concern, with setting an international standard. So if there is an international standard, at least city councils can be aware that there's a standard, can look at it, can turn to companies such as Julian's and say, do you operate within that standard? Is that standard even sufficient? And so on. So there's so many pieces that have to come together, from regulatory, standards, city councils, responsiveness, enforcement, and so on. All that needs to come together, and that's the purpose and reason for the standards work that we're doing. It's in response to all of these things.
So the standards work that you're doing, the ISO standard 4448, is that something to do with, is that a logistics thing, or is it a livability thing? What's the purpose? What's it about?
Well, if you read it, it's a set of data standards and a set of protocols. Julian used the word protocols. There's protocols for this sort of freight and that. We even talked about 15 different sort of freight solutions. So there's protocols for each of those. And it sounds like V to X, engineering, communication, internet exchange of data, which it is at that level. If you don't have that in an agreed fashion, in a way that works for municipalities, in a way that works for the businesses that are on those streets who are being served by these various vehicles, if it doesn't work for the people that are pedestrians there or cyclists there, then you won't have livability. So at bottom, it is about livability. It's expressed as a body of communication standards. That's, if you read it, that's what it looks like. But if we don't get all of that in a way that works for all parties, we won't have livability. And you'll have things like you have them now. You'll have people reporting that the robotaxi is taking passengers away from transit, or the kinds of scrums, that rugby scrums that Scott referred to, and so on. You will have all of those kinds, which are not livability conducive, if you don't have a agreed, sensible logistics oriented. Sorry to be boring with logistics, but how else are you going to do it? This problem has been with us for a long time. You know, many of us know that Julius Caesar had the same problem with how do you bring goods. Of course, they were on donkey carts or ox carts, but it doesn't matter. How do you bring those? How do you bring goods into a city? And in those who don't know, in that case, he banned these carts from coming in during the day, the business day. And then, of course, that kept people awake at night from all the clatter and noise. It's still not solved today.
Yeah.
Julian Wiggley is working on Julius Caesar's problem for 2,000 years ago. So,
I'm named after him, actually.
Sorry?
I'm named after him, actually. So my mother named me Julian after Julius Caesar, so thank you for that, Ben.
I thought so.
Okay, so that's very helpful, Ben, and it sounds to me like actually the work that you're doing on the ISO standard is actually very, very important, really important. I mean, not just in terms of our sort of narrow field, but in terms of livability and for that reason, the future of downtown. Because if you don't get the livability right, you're not going to attract people to downtowns. So it's quite fundamental to retailers and to businesses in core centres. And I understand that you've got your first open stakeholder meeting in a few weeks. Is that open? Are people able to actually join that input?
It's by invitation, and there's still spaces, and we can still invite more people. So here's what happens: is about 3 times a year I have a stakeholder meeting. We have a stakeholder meeting, and during that meeting, which is constrained to 25 people, just for the logistics, because it's in a roundtable format. It doesn't work in this format. It has to be all 25 people being able to contribute. And those people are representing municipalities. They may be representing companies such as Julian's, for example. They may be representing universities, so that you know, anybody on this panel is certainly welcome to get an invitation. I would invite them to that. And that the next one happens to be on October the 6th coming up. And that one is, I mean, it's open still to yet more participants, but in the end, the idea is to have supporters, in other words, sponsors of the standard, because I should tell the listeners how standards works. ISO standards are a voluntary activity, and our work on that as project leader of that is a voluntary activity. And the standard, because it has to work for municipalities, it has to work for companies that are providing the services, it has to work for business districts and so on, business improvement districts and so on. So we invite sponsors from all those different stakeholder groups to actually set the standard. So the standard isn't, the project leader might be typing the standard in, but it's actually set by the stakeholders, those people who support the standard, who say what needs to be in it. Because that's the only way it's going to work. It's a collaborative, it's an industry, urban planning collaborative activity. And you're welcome to send me an email at burn@harmonizemobility.com, and we'll discuss a potential for you to be a stakeholder.
Good, great. Okay, thanks, Ben. I'm going to move back to my other panelists now. Scott, if I could turn to you again. We often hear from Elon Musk that he's confident that Tesla will have basic functionality for level 5 autonomy complete this year. And he's not actually talking about selling new cars. He's not talking about hardware. He's talking about just level 5 software to update existing Teslas. Could you say something about a realistic timescale for the widespread deployment of autonomous vehicles that cities might want to sort of bear in mind, however sort of vaguely, that takes into account not just the kind of tech readiness of AVs, but also the political and social acceptability of autonomous vehicles?
Sure, thank you, Alana. First, I just want to say I cannot take credit for the rugby scrum analogy. That comes from one of our interviewees. We promised them all absolute anonymity so that they would speak freely with us. So I cannot even attribute it to the proper person to whom it should be attributed, but it's not mine. This is an excellent question, Alana. It reminds me of the first lesson that we teach in transportation planning school, or transport planning school to Julian. Give them a prediction or give them a date, but don't give them both a prediction and a date that it's going to happen. So in seriousness, there's no one that's perfectly positioned to say with absolute certainty what the pace of AV commercialization will be. It's going to be pushed forward, it's going to be pulled backwards by future events, which are going to be inherently unpredictable. I've been personally involved in the planning for autonomous driving for coming up on a decade. And I can't tell you how many of the predictions that were being made just a half decade ago haven't aligned either way with the facts as they are on the ground today. The way that I think about the pace of the rollout of AVs is as a sort of team effort marathon rather than an individual sprint, but with the team members all having very different roles and indeed very different motivations. We all know that our governments and our private industry move fundamentally at different clock speeds. So you're absolutely right that the technological availability at scale and in very robust form to be at commercial scale is only one piece of the puzzle. We've also got legislative action, political will, what the courts say, everything that Salika mentioned a little bit earlier. Societal acceptance, these are all going to have huge influence on when AVs delivering mobility services will become normalized in our cities, our suburbs, and our rural areas. So while Tesla may be confident about their ability to deliver level 5, which is sort of autonomous driving under go anywhere, under any weather conditions, whatever, which even human drivers don't do, but leaving that aside, even to the extent that turns out to be true, there's many hurdles that will require much of the sort of collaboration that we've heard from Bern, we've heard it from Salika, we've heard from Julian all talking about, that stakeholder collaboration. It doesn't all hinge on how quickly the car makers, Tesla included, end up delivering, quote, the technology.
Great, thank you, Scott. Salika, if I could bring you in here. One of the things that people talk about when they talk about AVs, there seems to be quite a lot of optimistic talk, really. And it's these issues around livability that Bern's raised. So this idea that because autonomous vehicles can travel closer together that way, and because they don't kind of sway within lanes, and they kind of tighter together, the idea is that this gives scope for having cycle lanes and wider sidewalks and urban greening and all these wonderful things. And it's a very optimistic idea, it sounds, of what autonomous vehicles could do. But the kind of obvious question is that this kind of change, this infrastructure, is going to cost huge amounts of money. Not just in terms of capital, but ongoing revenue for the upkeep of things as well. Could you say a little bit about where this money is going to come from? Who's going to pay? You've mentioned already about city governments losing money because they no longer have the parking, because parking will be less necessary with AVs. Who's going to pay? Where's the money going to come from?
Well, first I want to say I happen to be one of those people who is excited, enthusiastic. I'm a cheerleader for autonomous vehicles. What I also understand is, as a cheerleader, I have to be aware of who's really carrying the ball down the field, who's in play, and as much as I want them to get there, and as much as I'm rooting for them, if they don't have the skills and the tools available to them, this may not be their game where they're going to win. So right now, today, even if Tesla reaches that magic spot where they've got the ability for widespread use before December 31st, our nation's infrastructures, our cities, our urban and rural communities are not ready. And that's, for me, the sort of call to alarm. both from a political will and standpoint, as Scott has mentioned, and also the concerns as a citizen. So I'm going to put where we're going to get the money from aside for a second and just talk briefly about how are we going to engage the average user, the general public. If we don't begin to bring them along with the enthusiasts on this panel, we could build it, but they won't come. We have an obligation, not just those of us who are working in the industry, but both government and the manufacturers to provide an understanding of what the technology really is, what it really can do, who it can help, and not be pie in the sky. We don't want to blow it up to be something that it's not, because it is not utopia, but certainly for vast segments of our society, it will improve and can improve their way of life. In terms of revenue, in terms of how you're going to pay for it, Julian's talked about this wrestling, and I love Scott's analogy about that rugby analogy about the curbside. It is necessary for us to understand that our infrastructure today is woefully short of where it should be. We have bridges that are crumbling, roadways that are in ill repair, and also because of, I'm going to take us back to COVID-19 a little bit, we see major cities. We looked at New York City itself is requesting $12 billion to meet the short gap in transportation between this year and the end of 2021. We can't get, to Bern's point, what we have today in good order before we start turning to tomorrow. The dollars and cents must come from somewhere. And manufacturers and government have to start finding ways to bake it into our already existing infrastructure and our already existing transportation. If we're all fighting for that curb, then let's pay for the curb. For some reason, I don't know why, Amazon delivers at my house every day. Should I pay a 5% additional tax because they come to my doorstep every day? That may be necessary. But we also have to be mindful, especially those who are in the planning arena, of not leaving anybody out of the equation. We take it for granted, those of us who have cell phones and laptops and iPads, that the ability for transportation could just be a click of our smartphone away. But there are vast segments of this country and certainly around the world who do not have that personal infrastructure. As a society, we have to determine whether or not we want to bear those expenses. And it's not a giveaway. I know that sometimes when we look at those who have not, we call it welfare and all these adjectives that aren't necessarily friendly. But what's good for the other person is good for me. If I can assist and create equity so that you can have a job and I can have a job and we can all feed our families and have opportunities for healthcare, and transportation will allow that, then we have to figure out a way to bake those costs into our everyday living, which could include Salika having to pay 5 or 10 cents every time Amazon comes to her doorstep.
Thank you, Salika. I think you raise very important issues, and I think equity is almost like a web panel in itself, really, as some of these issues. Could I turn to you, Julian? I think in recognition that there's a variety of players who could contribute to providing funding for the sorts of changes that are necessary. But what about these companies? So Grid Smarter City, do you see yourself as a company? Are you going to be able to work in the AV world? How would that work? And in particular on the issue of payments, are you able to set yourself up so that you can facilitate these micro payments? So if Amazon pulls up to Salika's house, can you charge by the minute that they're outside?
Yeah, I mean, Grid business model is actually predicated on these new sets of curb users actually paying to use the curb. So I certainly hope that they'll pay in the future, otherwise we don't have a business. And yes, we can cope with micropayments, but what I would say is the pilots and the projects we've done with some of the big parcel delivery companies, they find the management overhead of having to reconcile potentially millions of micropayments. It just doesn't work for them, and economically, with credit and debit card processing fees, it doesn't really make sense. So the result of the pilots that we've done means that the big parcel company we work for in a city in Sunderland, for example, they want a monthly invoice. So they want all those micro transactions netted up and then do a single payment at the end of the month. So it's horses for courses. You know, the big delivery operators can operate that way. Even some of the smaller operators can operate that way. So yes, we can support micro transactions, but I would say in the real world, the operators, private companies want those wrapped up into single payments. It's just easier to do.
Yeah.
And in terms of AVs, I think, yes, our solutions will apply to AVs and sidewalk drones because AVs and sidewalk drones, they'll have to understand curbside restrictions and regulations in the same way as a human-powered vehicle. So they need to know where they can legally wait, where they can legally park or unload, and how much it will cost. Which also means that both curbs and, in additional to curbs, sidewalks will also need to be digitized. However, I think there's one area which I find really interesting, and that's the intersection between sidewalk drones and roadside vehicles. So for example, if a sidewalk drone is waiting to meet the roadside vehicle for the transfer of goods from the vehicle to the drone, then where can it legally wait and for how long? Will it have to book a curbside parking slot? Or if it's on the sidewalk, will it have to book a sidewalk parking slot, for example? And where can it legally do that? Also, Bern mentioned accessibility. And Grid also has another solution called Assist Me that we developed to help disabled travelers get from A to B seamlessly. So as a company, we are intimately concerned about the lack of sidewalk regulations governing potential conflicts between drones and people with reduced mobility on the sidewalk. So I think a lot more thought needs to be given generally to accessibility and safety regarding sidewalk drones and other users of the sidewalk.
Yeah, Julian, the way I like to see that, or the way I express that, is if we automate what we have now, I mean, the way things are now, and we just put automation on top of that, we're just going to make the mess that we have go a lot faster, which is absolutely going to make very many more scrums than we have now. So we have to rethink how it is that we share space because of the number of shared uses or the number of modalities of sharing of space I'm talking about has increased dramatically. I mean, we now eat on the sidewalk. But
yeah, and we're in danger of moving congestion from the road to the sidewalk. So, I mean, you know, if we scale up and have thousands and thousands of these sidewalk drones competing with pedestrians and other sidewalk users, then what will be the impact?
One of the elements of the standard that the standard considers is how can a business district on a block by block basis limit the number of drones at any one moment. In other words, it would be unworkable, to your point, to have literally 40 or 50 drones on a single sidewalk. They would fit, but then that's all that would fit there. So should that be limited to 2 or 4, whatever? And that's different from place to place. Some places would say no, none, depending on time of day. Some other block might allow 6 and so on. But that has to be set locally, and there needs to be a protocol for setting that and a body of data to communicate that to other companies. Because to your point, one of the delivery companies arrives, says, well, I'd like to release 3 drones to deliver something. I need to find a place for my truck to park, and I need to actually have reserved the ability or the right to use the sidewalk for X number of minutes for Y number of vehicles or drones, for example. That's one of the many elements of the standard that has to be worked out in a collaborative fashion. Again, Julian, with companies like yours and with the cities that use the services that companies like yours are going to provide.
Right, thanks, Bern. Did any of the other panelists want to mention anything before we move on to questions?
I think it's really interesting what Bern just mentioned about shifting the congestion of, in this example, delivery robots from on the sidewalk into the electronic system. I think that's potentially a very powerful way. Get rid of the physics of congestion, which are inefficient for all sorts of reasons, and turn it into congestion in an electronic queuing system, all sorts of reasons to push those sorts of solutions forward.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, I agree with that. Thanks, Scott. Okay, Jerry, if I could turn back to you. Do we have any questions for our panelists?
So thanks, Alana. And right now I don't have any questions. So I definitely encourage people that are sitting in on the webinar today, if you have some questions, this is the time to ask.
Could I then, before we bring anyone else in, could I perhaps ask any of our panelists if they have questions for the other panelists? That's a no.
So one of the questions that I have, or one of the things I'm thinking about a lot, is, and I'll put it out as a question. It occurs to me, and so my question is, do you agree or not? It occurs to me that we're going to see sidewalk drones at scale, a lot sooner than we're going to see robotaxis at scale. And the reason is there's very many fewer barriers, legislative barriers, space barriers, union barriers. There's all kinds of barriers to robotaxis, transit unions, and so on, that are not barriers for sidewalk drones. And my question, the other thing, do you think that we're going to see sidewalk drones at scale sooner than we're going to see robotaxi at scale?
Yeah, I think that's it's a very interesting question. And when I was in the City of London, we did talk to, we discussed sidewalk drones and the use of them in the city, and there was very much a feeling that they were not seen to be something that could really be managed within the city. The City of London is quite special in that it's essentially a medieval street pattern, so very narrow streets. But these small things going around were seen as too much for densely populated city centres. And so, so I think a lot of it is going to depend on where it is. But I don't know if it's, what's happening across other cities in the States in particular. So they are well used. Starships, I know, have been well used across different cities, but how they're managed and how they're viewed is not something that I think a huge amount of research has been done on.
So I think to the point of, I just wanted to comment on this idea of delivery bots and Starship in particular. When we deploy them in cities and we haven't explained to the populace at large what it is and that you might see it, we are going to create additional problems on top of congestion, is people attacking them. I witnessed myself here in Washington, D.C., the delivery bot on the sidewalk and little boy kicking them and the dog trying to do its business on it. I know what it is. My next door neighbor doesn't know what it is. And so whether it's government or manufacturers, we have to do better in terms of alerting the general public about what is out there. When I see vehicles testing, driving around the streets and clearly mapping and testing, I know what it is. I recognize the LiDAR on top of the vehicles. But again, my neighbor doesn't. And if we want to have widespread deployment, we have to have widespread understanding of what this technology is, where it's operating, and what the benefits could be for our communities.
So are you saying, Sarika, then that there should be a conversation, that city government needs to have a conversation with people? Is it to almost ask permission from their public to ask them, is this acceptable, or are you happy? I mean, some sort of conversation needs to be had with local disability groups, for instance, surely.
Well, listen, that's what I have termed the political economy. It's that government will, coupled with, are there revenue concerns, are there impacts on the community? When you build in a suburban community and you want to put in a tract of 200 houses, or even in a city where you want to put in a new community, a letter shows up in everybody's mailbox. People are advised that this is coming and here are the impacts to the community. And then the community responds. They're either all for it and they're rah-rah. And if they are not, the dialogue is opened between them and the builder until they can get to a point of agreement to move on. We haven't done that. What has happened here is government has said, sure, come on in some cities. We'd love you to test in some cities. Here are our roadways. Feel free to engage in some cities. And yet they haven't done the work of speaking to the community and letting those know who live there that this is what's taking place on their roadways. And I think that it is a detriment to the community and eventually could lead to a stall in the widespread deployment if we don't start to bring people along.
And presumably, the longer you leave it to have these kind of conversations, the more money is going to go into these projects, and then the harder it is then to sort of pull back from them, I guess.
Absolutely.
So Ben, sorry, Jerry.
Yeah, we do have some questions. So the question I'm going to read here is, who is in charge of defining the curbside payment policies? Local governments, national governments, international entities? Question. And will this differ between, say, Europe and North America?
Ben, do you want to answer that?
So I'm going to give a very approximate answer. Yes, there's differences. There's differences from city to city, but the issue of an international, I'm just going to talk from an international standards perspective. The international standard is written to be used to whatever degree it can be used internationally. So although if I was advising a city, I would be sensitive to local issues, but in writing international standard, I am somewhat less so. That's not a tremendously good answer because we do consider, for example, I'm probably not answering it exactly the way it's being asked, but for example, we need to consider right and left. It's kind of a trivial instance, but here's an example that differs from place to place. There's something called shy distance, and shy distance is how close the pedestrian walks when they're walking by a wall, for example. How far away from a wall does someone walk? And when I'm passing another pedestrian on the sidewalk, how much space do I leave between people? That differs from location to location, for example. So why I'm answering the question this way is that the standard sets out a body of descriptors, and the local parameterization of those, descriptors is set locally so that we can have an international standard, and conformance to that international standard is a local conformance. I don't know if I've answered that really as well as the asker is hoping, but that's where that is now.
Alana, I'd like to jump in on that. As a former deputy administrator of a state motor vehicle agency, I will tell you that what one state adopts as their law, another state may not adopt as their laws. The federal government can put certain pressures on states if they want them to commit to certain regulation, but we have very, very different rules and regulations state to state across the US involving things, as Bern said, even just sidewalk usage in terms of spacing. Our rules of the road are different from city to city. Our traffic violation laws are different from states to state. While we could have an overarching federal guidance here, the likelihood of getting that is very slim, as we do not have an infrastructure bill in the United States currently. And we know we need one, and we haven't been able to get one. We know we need some overarching regulation when it comes to autonomous vehicles. And while we have consensus that we need it from our legislators, we haven't had that yet. The idea of some standard international way of addressing sidewalks is brilliant and something needed. But I fear that we just don't have, at least in the United States, the political will at this point. And I don't know what will eventually push us there.
Great, thank you, Salika. I think we better move on. If we got another question there, Jerry, we should take that before we close.
Sure. Okay. So any thoughts on how we get the attention of legislators to start addressing these issues proactively instead of waiting?
I'm going to have to throw that back to you, Salika, I'm afraid.
I think one of the things that I realized both in my state service and in my federal service is associations get attention. We as the individual could write to our congressman or a senator all we want, but associations have backing and have merit and have a seat at the table. My recommendation always is where your state associations lie on these issues, talk to them, have them engage with their political will at the federal level in order to get this done. We see that there is a real need. It's wonderful that we can say safety is our ultimate goal, and we don't want to stand in the way of innovation. But a phrase that I have coined is we need bumper cars. We need some guidance that says, okay, this is the lane, corny as it is, but this is the lane that you can operate in as you deploy these new technologies. Reaching out to your associations in your state on a variety of levels, I think, is the best way to go.
Okay, did any of the other panelists want to jump in there?
I guess, sorry, Julian, I can say this from what's happened in London. The driver for our project, it's not a pilot actually, our solution has been procured by the London Borough of Southwark for a particular area of Southwark where air quality is very bad. And it's an association called the Low Emissions Neighbourhood in that particular area of Southwark that came along and pressed for change. Managed to get some money together, managed to get some budget, and this is where the driver is coming from. So it is community groups, associations putting pressure on local politicians and officials to do something.
And Scott, did you want to come in there as well?
Sure, just really to absolutely echo support of what Salika just described. There's an entire infrastructure of scientific committees. There's the Transportation Research Board. There's all sorts of, there's AASHTO committees, all sorts of organizations in our field, and getting organized and getting on the same page before communicating with leadership is absolutely the way to go.
Yeah. Great. Okay,
I'm wondering how much the drawdown of revenue from parking is going to have municipalities sit up and say, we need to get ourselves organized in a way that we can actually charge, microcharge and so forth for these new technologies. And I think that's going to be one of the key drivers.
Yeah. Great. I think we're out of time now for more questions. So I'm going to thank thank you to my panelists, and thanks to the audience for joining in. And I'll hand back to Jerry now.
Okay, and thanks again. Thanks all the panelists. Thanks to everyone, all the attendees. We don't have a panel unless we have attendees, so thanks for being with us today. We're going to share the recorded version, and you can also look forward to more webinars in the future on this topic. Again, thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Everybody. Bye-bye.